I put in work, a lot of work. Got on my grind to make it work. I put in time to ease my mind. Now all the time I see dollar signs. I got the juice and barbecue. Yeah, I keep making moves, cause I know what to do.
Kaveh, appreciate you coming out tonight.
Oh my God, thank you guys. It's my pleasure.
We're excited to have you. Heard about some of the great work you've done in the past, and it's a pleasure to meet you in person. To kind of get kicked off, I think for those who don't know you, like give us a glimpse into your history, your background, and your entry point into entrepreneurship and the spirits industry.
Yeah, thanks again for that. Well, let's see. As it was mentioned, I was born in Iran. I immigrated to the States in 1979. I was 14 years old. Basically, as you probably all know, some of you might be too young to remember, but we had a huge crisis there in the Middle East, and the revolution broke out, and we practically, basically, literally overnight, packed our bags and left the country. Not knowing exactly if we're going to go back or not, but once we got out, the situation got worse, and we never went back. My uncle actually had lived in Chicago. He moved to Chicago in the early 60s to go to the University of Illinois. He fell in love with a Polish girl from Chicago, married her, and ended up staying in Chicago. So he was our kind of connecting point to the U.S., and then we immigrated here, and then went to school in California, and then slowly got into psychology and had a clinical practice for about 20 years. But during that stint, I think the question of entrepreneurship, I've always had a soft spot for business, and in the 90s when I moved to New York for my internship, I had a clothing company. That was my first entree to basically the entrepreneur kind of experience. The name of the company was Soap Dodger. It was 1991. We were making all the baggy clothes that the hip hop rappers were wearing. Ended up actually selling some stuff to some of the folks like Biggie in Brooklyn, and got into that hip hop scene, and then the rave scene. Our tagline was "Too busy raving to be bathing." We had a great time. The company went like this and went like this, but I learned a hell of a lot, and that was really kind of the seed of what ended up being Rabbit Hole later on.
Wow. So I gotta ask, I heard California, Chicago, all the places that people want to leave Kentucky to go. So why Kentucky?
Yeah, it's a great question. I started coming down to Louisville nearly 20 years ago when I met my wife. My wife and I met in Chicago. She's from Louisville. So I started coming down here about 20 years ago. Honestly, there was something really charming about Louisville and Kentucky. I think for me, that was the beginning of it. And then it was bourbon. I was a big Scotch guy. I've always had a soft spot for fine spirits, and I just couldn't believe there's not a whole lot of folks outside of this Kentucky-Tennessee belt that really know about bourbon. And as probably everybody here knows, at the Kentucky Distillers Association, we referred to about 2 decades of dark years of bourbon, where basically everybody's competing with vodka, so there's not a whole lot going on, and bourbon was languishing. And of course, I didn't know that, but I started coming down here really realizing, aside from just the standards that you see on the back bar, there's a history, there's a tradition, and that was really the bug that got me, that kind of kept bringing me back, and ended up getting deeper and deeper. And then the last piece is that, in comparison to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, there's something really lovely about opportunity in a place like Louisville and Kentucky. Like, to me, it's one of those things as an entrepreneur, you always got to zig where everybody's zagging.
Yeah.
So you want to see where the kind of open space is. And that's what really prompted to come back here and start really thinking about settling down.
Yeah, I love that. talk about opportunity, right? So working in Chicago as a successful clinical psychologist, walk me through the moment where you told your family, I want to go make bourbon and, and create a company in an industry that you weren't familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a process. I mean, first of all, just to give you a little context, my wife knows that I'm a little nuts, so that's kind of, that was already in the mix. I mean, she knew what she's getting herself into, but it was a slow transition. I started really thinking about it. I started fantasizing about it, and having grown up in California, actually, in the late '70s, early '80s. Believe it or not, it was really similar to what's happening in Kentucky now, in the sense that there was not a whole lot of wineries out there, and people really didn't think about Napa and Sonoma the way they do now. So you had the Wagner family, you had the Mondavis. That was really it. There was not a whole lot of other big brands there. And I remember a time where people in Sonoma actually would say, there's too many wineries. And, this is now 40, 50 years ago. And we know what happened to that region. So that experience was really kind of the kind of background of what made me think that there's a light bulb moment here, where there's an opportunity here, because you had basically four companies that were dominating essentially the industry. And when I really dug into it, they were making the same recipes. I mean, there's not a whole lot of variation. The golden age of bourbon was right after the Civil War, between post-Civil War to Prohibition. We have nearly 2,000 distilleries here, a lot of farmer distillers, a lot of folks doing small stuff. And that context, plus what I realized about what is magical about bourbon, and Christy's here from my team, she hears me say this all the time. I say bourbon is 51% corn, 49% possibility. And what I mean by it is that if you're into Scotch, Irish whiskey, Canadian, Japanese, there's not a whole lot of real innovation and excitement to me when it comes to making whiskey. With bourbon, you got the requirement that it has to be 51% corn, but the other 49% is really whatever you want. So to me, there's that culinary reference that got that light bulb going when I'm like, holy shit. We can do some really cool stuff here, which is not just, one mash bill or two mash bills. You can innovate a whole plethora of whiskey expressions organically. And that was really the foundation of getting here. And then training with some of the old master distillers here. That's one of the nice things about Kentucky. There's a lot of great people that helped me out. And then the last and most important thing was convincing my wife. and that took a little longer.
Yeah. So I would say, knowing that you saw that opportunity being in Sonoma and coming to Kentucky, and knowing that it's more of a family business, what was the toughest part about breaking into the industry? I know you said you had some master distillers that were willing to help you out, but what were some of the toughest moments with breaking into that industry?
So it's interesting because the learning part of it, learning how to make whiskey was relatively easy, because at the time, now this is going back about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, the master distillers that we all know, like Jim Rutledge, Chris Morris, and Larry Ebersol, who was my mentor, nobody really thought about them the way we're thinking about them today, as some kind of, face of the brand hero or those kinds of things. They were not a celebrity. So these guys used to come to my house, and we sat around the kitchen table drinking whiskey. I mean, they were just glad that we had a chance to chat and somebody was interested in their work. So that part of it was actually relatively easy, and everybody was super friendly. The toughest part of it was on the business side of it. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, 10 years ago, I could not find a single bank in the state of Kentucky that understood bourbon as a commodity. Not one. I realized that all the producers, really, they're getting their money, their banking is happening in New York. It's not happening here, unless, you had Heaven Hills of the world that had, those guys have their own bank, for God's sake. So I had to go and knock on a lot of doors to find if I can, finding investors, mm-hmm. and the second part of it was finding bank that could actually extend the line of credit to get us going.
Wow. That's really amazing and intriguing to kind of see the differences of business, how bourbon was back then to now. Taking a look at your bourbon and Rabbit Hole, can you walk us through, you mentioned some of the mash bills, so I would love to hear some of the distilling process that you kind of run at Rabbit Hole and really some of the inspiration and creativity for your mash bills.
Yeah, so I started with a 5-gallon still, then graduated to 23-gallon still, and just experimenting a lot and sharing what I was doing with the guys that I had mentioned. Larry Ebersol, who was at one point was the master distiller at the old Seagram's plant, MGP, and then at Wild Turkey. He took a shine, and we started having lots and lots of conversations. And part of my inspiration was this whole idea of 51% corn, 49% magic, in the sense that I'm trying to bring in different ingredients to play around with. The second inspiration was actually the craft beer movement, because the craft beer guys were experimenting with all kinds of really cool, malts and hops and those types of things. So I started really getting interested in malted grains, and that was really the window that opened up things in terms of the products that we started making. Like Cave Hill here, the first one, the black label, that's a 4-grain triple malt bourbon. I was a big Scotch guy before. I wanted to make a bourbon that the secondary flavoring grain is barley rather than wheat or rye. So this one is 70% corn, 10% malted wheat, and you got 10% malted barley and 10% honey malted barley. And that really kind of opened up a whole list of other recipes that I came up with, and it was just all playing around with different grain configurations. High Gold is corn with malted rye and malted barley. So both of those, if you take them as an example, they have 70% corn. They're aged in charred and toasted barrels, wood-fired. But those 30%, that's 30% ingredient, makes a world of difference in terms of the flavors here. So that was really kind of the inspiration in the beginning of coming up with these different recipes. And that's what I think really makes Rabbit Hole unique, because what you're drinking here is one of a kind. I can't blend it. I can't buy it and blend it, source it. If our barrel warehouses burn out tomorrow, I got to start from scratch.
Wow. So you talked about early on getting started, and we all know the Rabbit Hole Distillery that we have today. But early on, how did you get started? How did you test your recipes early on? And it's a long process to getting a bourbon. 3 to 5 years in before you know what you got. So how did you make it through? That, and what were those beginnings like?
Yeah, I think funny that you asked that, because that's actually part of the reason we named the company Rabbit Hole. Because when I started working with Larry, coming up with these recipes, my wife Heather used to say, "How do you know if this damn thing's going to be any good?" And Larry and I would look at her and say, "We don't know." I mean, and that's the truth of it, because you don't know. There's so many different factors. And that's when she started talking about, how are you going to take the family down the rabbit hole? She said it once, twice, third time, fourth time. I'm like, hell, that's a great name for a distillery. So that's how Rabbit Hole came to be.
Shout out to the wife.
The credit goes to her. But I lost my train of thought. Ask the question one more time.
So how did you get started? What were those beginnings like? How did you get your first recipes tested and what?
Yeah, so it started with that 5-gallon still, and then graduated 23, and I'm going back and forth playing around with this stuff, giving samples to Larry, and then eventually got to a point that I got to start laying these things down, and I decided that we need to find a distillery, because obviously we didn't have a distillery at the time. That was, believe it or not, the toughest thing about getting started, aside from the money side of it. I couldn't find a single distillery in the state of Kentucky that did contract distillation. So they would sell you aged liquid, and believe it or not, this is really funny, because back in 2013, 2012, I could pick up barrels of 5-year-old Kentucky bourbon for like $600. $700. I mean, that's how the world has changed in the last 10 years. But nobody would actually make my recipes for me. So it took me 2 years to find a distillery. Eventually, New Riff Distillery up in northern Kentucky.
Yeah.
Had just opened up. Was good friends with Ken Lewis. Ken's opened up his distillery. He didn't have barrels, believe it or not, because 2014 was actually the biggest barrel shortage we had at the time. I was able to help him find barrels. He helped me to get the contract, and that's how we started rolling. But it took me 2 years to find a distillery that would actually start making the recipes for me so we can scale it up.
And that speaks to the relationships right there. I think Ricky and I always talking about putting rooms like this together is a piece of, you have the business, right? But a lot of times where the luck comes into place, really the energy in creating relationships, and to see a new distillery launching and not seeing them as competition, but working together to help one another is really impactful and really speaks to the importance of creating.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I think it all comes down to relationships. I remember Ken saying to me, all right, so we're going to lay down your liquid for you. And he was going to make the first barrel for Rabbit Hole when they first opened up the distillery. And I said, there's no way you just built this amazing distillery and you're going to make the first barrel for somebody else. So, the first truck came in, it was for them to lay down their liquid. And, that's the other thing about the bourbon industry in Kentucky. I can't tell you how receptive everybody has been to helping not only me, but helping each other, because I think there is this philosophy that rising tides help all.
Yeah.
And it's genuinely been that case, especially when it comes to the technical things, getting each other to kind of learn about how to do it and get things rolling.
Yeah, so a lot of these things, I'll take a look at your bottle and I think about the name, Cave Hill. I see it as an ode to kind of Kentucky. And can you kind of talk to how you kind of laid that legacy, those folks, and have those odes to the greats in bourbon through your labeling, branding of your bourbons?
Yeah, I think starting with the package, obviously the liquid has to be good. I think my recommendation, I get calls now, at least a few handful of times every month for budding distillers. I tell folks that the first thing you got to do, the liquid's got to be distinct. It's got to be good and it's got to be distinct. I think there's way too many great whiskeys out there, so you got to find out your point of differentiation. That was top of mind for me. But beyond that, the packaging and branding is really, really important, obviously, because it's all about an emotional connection for people. I wanted to design a package that is not the traditional, doesn't have the same traditional kind of whiskey cues. If you look at the bottle, for example, it's tall, it's sturdy, it's strong, it's easy to handle for bartenders, but it also has a sash and it has a taper. So it's got masculine and feminine elements, because even back then I was thinking that I really want to have a brand that is inviting to both men and women. And that was really part of the thinking behind the design of the bottle. And then the names, it really is founded on the idea that, to me, whatever your business is, in our case, whiskey, it's an opportunity to tell stories. Mm-hmm. Because, listen, the reality is people can make money. You can make money 1,001 different ways. But are you doing something that's meaningful, and it's also something that's actually enlightening people? And for me, especially as not only U.S. being my adopted home, but also Kentucky being my adopted home, one of the things that I want to do is that through our whiskey try to introduce more and more people, not only to bourbon, but also to Louisville, to understand and see the beauty of the city and what we have here. So Cave Hill, as you pointed out, it's a nod to, the reason I named it there, because we have most dead distillers buried in Cave Hill Cemetery. So it's an opportunity to talk about the legends that came before us. Heigold is a reference to Christian Heigold. Now, Christian Heigold was a German immigrant who came here, and he's a stonecutter. So there's all these stone carvings of him, which was really a tribute to kind of his love for America. But most people in Louisville don't know about Christian Heigold. So that was the reason we named Heigold after him. So that kind of thinking has been behind the idea of these secondary namings, to help us tell stories about not just Rabbit Hole, but also our community.
I feel like that's a huge thing behind even your distillery in itself, you go to a normal distillery and it's probably not a place that you're going to wear your clean clothes into, but you go to the Rabbit Hole Distillery and that's a different story. So could you talk about a little bit how you kind of change the game there with your distillery and your processes, and even opening it up for others to bring their recipes and you all.
Yeah, I think when I started learning about with the industry, I realized there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. Honestly, people didn't know what's in the bottle. If you happen to go to the distillery, you didn't really get to see what's happening behind the scenes. And then the last thing is that I think just making whiskey is beautiful. I remember people talking about how we want to, improve or increase manufacturing, get people more excited about manufacturing, or bringing manufacturing back to the States. Well, for me, one of the ways to do that is make manufacturing sexy. That was really the creative direction to our teams, that I want to make the process of making whiskey not only fully transparent, so you can see it, no smoke and mirrors, but also I want you to be able to find it exciting and appealing. So it's aesthetically pleasing and you're enjoying it. You're in the senses. That was kind of the thinking behind it. And the last thing was that it's got to be entertaining, right? I mean, you guys have been to the distillery. It's all about a place where spirits is about bringing people together. So ultimately, not only we make our whiskey there, but it's our home and it's our place to bring people together. And, along those lines, it's our artwork. I think you guys, we haven't talked about it yet, but I think the artwork is also really important for me, because it's really about how we convey our values without getting in anybody's face. It's right there on our walls. It's like coming to somebody's home. Where they stand. And that's kind of what was the idea behind the design and the interior of the facility.
I love that you brought that up, because I was going there next. But I wanted to just double tap on something after you're talking through that piece of innovation, right? Doing something in an industry that hasn't been broken, or done differently, and just, hey, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to do it transparent. It speaks to a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurs early stage. Like, you might look at an industry that's been around for 50 plus years, and there's still opportunity by looking at different lens and operating differently. So I just wanted to point that out, because that's really cool to hear the thought process as you built out Rabbit Hole. Oftentimes I hear you refer to Rabbit Hole as the original works of bourbon, and you mentioned the art piece. I wanted to kind of just hear from you a little bit more of the relationship of how you look at bourbon, but also art. I feel like it's a lot of art, not only outside of these bottles, but specialty bottles that you all do some really special labels. And I see artistry in a lot of those labels. I want to hear more about your background and really that relationship.
Yeah, I think to me, Rabbit Hole gives me a platform to, as I mentioned, bring people together. I think we live in a very complicated world. I think, especially now, it's politically charged. I think it's very divisive. I think it's really easy to get into this binary thinking of, tribalism, and it's all or nothing. And, I don't like that shit. I don't know how else to tell you. I mean, I think it's all,
I don't either.
And I think that when you break bread with someone or you imbibe with someone, it's an opportunity to really get close and have a conversation. And I think that, there's got to be inherently respect for each other's values and beliefs. And I think art, for me, is probably the most pro-social way of being able to connect, right? I think art speaks for itself. You don't have to say anything. Be it at the distillery, we have Tommy Smith's bust of Tommy Smith at our distillery. Glenn Kaino is a Korean artist who designed that. That's our value, man. I mean, I think we don't need to go around advertise it. We don't have to put a slogan around it. You come to our house, you know where we stand. You look at our team members, we have the most diverse workforce in the distilling industry right now. To me, art is a way of being able to just show people without spelling it out where we stand and who we are, basically. And I think with our single barrel program, we're trying to begin to give representation also to other folks, right? So everybody knows the story of Rabbit Hole. Everybody knows Alice in Wonderland. Everybody knows Lewis Carroll. But, as an example, we just hired a gentleman named Quincy Sutton. Quincy's an amazing illustrator out of Los Angeles. And, we've been doing these Alice in Wonderland series, right? And my creative direction to these artists is, look, I want you to give your interpretation of these classic characters. Just do it any way you want. We're not editing anything, The first release was with a Korean artist, Kasich, and the most recent one is Quincy. And, nobody's seen a Black Alice. We got a Black Alice.
Yeah.
We got a Black Hatter. This is the kind of stuff that I think, to me, it's about where do brands stand, and are we able to openly, expand representation through some classic, essentially, in this case, literature. And we're trying to do that through our single barrel program, because I think, again, part of my mission, aside from making great whiskey, is to bring people together.
So speaking on knowing where you stand, I think there's one obvious piece of artwork at the distillery, the deconstructed flag, that just tells you where you stand. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Donald Trump came into office. I was in Miami with an artist. His name is Jeremy Dean. Jeremy is a really talented guy, originally from Brooklyn, and Trump's first executive order was to ban 7 Muslim countries. And so Jeremy and I are, having a drink, talking about, what the hell is going on. And I said, I'd love for you to be able to do something. And I had seen his work before, which he was deconstructing different flags and weaving them back together. And he said, let me give it a shot. I think what I'm going to do, what he ended up doing was he deconstructed the 7 flags of those 7 Muslim countries. He did the same thing with the U.S. flag. And then he put them all back together. It's almost like a Persian carpet, if you think, this tapestry. You got the 7 countries' flags going horizontal and the U.S. flag going vertical. So you stand back, it looks like the U.S. flag. You get close, you see the intricacies of these colors coming together, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And I got to tell you, during all those years that Trump was in office, we had a lot of folks coming in, and when they hear the story, and the title is Executive Order 13769. So there is no hiding it. We're not pretending that it's not what it is. And when people ask, we tell them what it is. And, it's just, and by the way, I had 110 investors. The majority of them are right-wing Republicans here in Kentucky. None of them said a damn thing. None of them felt like it was the wrong thing to do. So it even allowed us to have these conversations as well. And again, that's where I think the magic of art is, where you're not fighting about it. You're expressing yourself in a way that is not aggressive. It's not violent, but it gives you an opportunity to have a discussion.
I love that. That's cool. Yeah, that's what we're supposed to do as entrepreneurs, chart new grounds, and having those conversations. Now, you talked about the collaboration with that artist and the bottles. I think Chris kind of spoke to that a little bit. I know is there an artist collaboration program where you collaborate with those artists? So I guess 2 questions. One, what are you looking for in those artists and in those those designs, and how does someone kind of apply for that?
Yeah, so our single barrel program is, the other name for it is basically Artist Series. And we have different creative buckets, if you would. One of them is the reinterpretation of Lewis Carroll, classic Lewis Carroll characters. Another bucket is what we call a landmark series, which we just launched the first one. It's a Louisville landmarks that we released 6 different landmarks within our city. And then the third one is a literary bucket. I kind of found my direction when I was a lost soul earlier, believe it or not, going to an English literature class and reading a couple of Shakespeare plays. It was Hamlet and Othello. And it took me years to realize as a psychologist that, one story is about a kid who's got issues with his parents, and a second one who's an outsider. And that was really my story in a lot of ways. And so The third bucket is a literary bucket, and we use different literary, basically, pieces as a reference for these artists. And the direction to them is really simple. So with the Shakespeare series that we did, I basically said, look, what I want you to do is take 6 Shakespeare plays and design a new, as if you're designing a new book cover for Othello, for Romeo and Juliet, and just kind of, or Hamlet. And that's it. With the Lewis Carroll characters, I just basically say, pick any of the Carroll characters you want, interpret them any way you want. Because, for me, the difference between craft and art is an artist, I'm looking for their interpretation. Yeah. I'm not looking for them to, rinse and repeat and copy some other style. I'm looking for their interpretation. And that interpretation is what I think is magical, what's beautiful.
I love that. Thinking through, hearing you speak and hearing the creative at Rabbit Hole, how do you balance the creative versus the business, and what strategies have you found effective in doing so?
Yeah, that's a little bit of it's like shifting gears. You're going right brain, left brain, right? Mm-hmm. So I love the marketing and branding conversations because there's a lot of creative ideas. For me, culture of the company is really key. And I think that's where probably psychology was the most helpful to create what we call a collective culture. We have a mantra which says, we have no master, we are a collective. And that's not only related to the fact that we don't have a master distiller, but it also, more importantly, it's about the way we operate. It doesn't matter from whiskey making to the branding side of it, to finance, anything else. We kind of basically make decisions on consensus. On the marketing and branding side, there's a lot of kind of right brain activity. It's just going to town, throwing stuff at the wall, back and forth. And that's the piece that, calls for a lot of creativity. And then there's other aspects of the business that are more basically require more logic, more discipline. For me, probably the toughest part of this experience has been on that finance side of it. That's not my strong suit, right? I come from psychology, social sciences. So the learning curve for me was primarily on how to get more discipline on, P&L, making sure that I've got my ducks in order on the financing, because, if I like something, I'll write the check. And I've learned the hard way that I gotta be measured, and I can't just kind of, throw money at something. And I think that is really a kind of right brain, left brain skill set.
Yeah. Get the financial models in order.
Yeah. So earlier I heard you speak to being the most diverse distillery in Kentucky. And could you talk about, I think a lot of companies say that they struggle with diversity. Could you talk about how you all have been intentional about that, and what strategies you all might have used to increase that diversity in an industry that doesn't have a very diverse staff?
Yeah, I think, it's a little bit counterintuitive, because I think a lot of companies go about it trying to force diversity when it needs to be, I think, organic. For me, it always starts with the culture. Culture is the air that you breathe, right? And if the culture is not right, it doesn't matter, what your quota is. You're not going to be able to not only retain, to hire, but also retain those people. That retention rate is not going to be there. So it really started with a pretty extensive effort to make sure that we got the right values in place, and really simplifying things like check your ego at the door. Mm-hmm. We don't want any prima donnas here. And we screen for that kind of stuff. That we're a merit-based company, because I don't care what background you are, what color skin you are. At the end of the day, we all roll up our sleeves and we got to get to work. And if shit doesn't get done, you're not going to last here. But I think at the same time, with that meritocracy, what we've discovered is that there's a lot of opportunity for growth. And we create that opportunity. You come in, and we've had people starting at basically janitorial service, becoming distillers, or moving to marketing, moving to even doing some works on different aspects of our operation. So it's just really about the kind of culture that you're trying to foster here that I think starts from the top down and it trickles down. If you don't have the right leadership that really has those values and practices those values, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I'm curious, because I kind of tested this over the last month working with Christy and Victoria and your team, and getting other stories of the corporate culture there. People are excited to represent and be a part of Rabbit Hole. So I'm kind of curious from like, whether it's from your background, what leadership qualities early on did you really infuse into the business to create that culture to what it is today?
Yeah, you know, when I was in practice as a psychologist, I can probably say that most people fell into two buckets. They either couldn't find their dream for one reason or another, either trauma, hardship. They just couldn't really find what they want in life. Or there are ones that had a better sense of it or had a sense of it, but didn't have the gumption or the wherewithal to go after it. And stories are different, and part of being a good therapist is you got to help kind of take some of those obstacles out of the way and open things up, right? And for me, one of the things that was really important is that I want to create a company where people want to come to work. They see the ladder of opportunity. And the first question that I ask, or at least one of the questions that I ask very early on, is, what do you want? What do you want in life? Like, what's the arc of your career, the way you envision it now? And not only have that as a baseline, but also continue that conversation so we know that a year, 2, 3 years from now, that arc may change. And how can we help you reach that arc, right? My executive assistant is an example. She was in the hospitality business. She was working for Chris Ruth Ruth's in Lexington. After 10 years in hospitality business in Las Vegas. Never been an executive assistant. I mean, hell, I don't even know if she really knew how to manage the whole Microsoft suite. But she figured it out, right? And 2 years later, not only she's a superstar, rock star in that position, now I'm actually starting to talk to her and say, what's next? Because you don't want to be my executive assistant for the rest of your life, do you? And if you do, that's okay. Yeah. As long as I need an assistant, there's a role for you. But knowing where she is as a woman in her mid-30s, and she's smart, she's ambitious, all right, what else, what direction you want to go? And that's just one example of multiple examples that we talk about on the management level that everybody's having with their team members. And it's something that, as the CEO, I want to hear about it. I want to hear what Joe wants, what Jane is wanting, and just get a sense of that and the discussions that we have. How do we help people move up? And if they're not even able to move up within our company, how do we help them move in another direction? We had a guy in finance. Actually, no, he was not in finance. He was in sales, if I remember correctly, who wanted to become a financial advisor. He was with Rabbit Hole for 3 years and then ended up becoming a financial advisor. I'm like, that's freaking great. Yeah. Yeah. And part of that was that inspiration, I think, for him was something that sprouted during his time at Rabbit Hole.
That's amazing. As we get ready to close out, I'm going to open up the Q&A from the audience in a second. So we'll take a few questions. So get your questions ready before we come back to the audience. But as Kaveh, I want to know from you, for any aspiring entrepreneurs in the room, what advice would you kind of give starting your company, and how will you infuse that into and mentor somebody else who's really looking to get into the spirits industry or just start a company in general?
I think the first thing you got to realize that entrepreneurship is contact sport. I mean, it's just, I don't know how else to say it. It's just contact sport. You're going to get bashed left and right. And I can't tell you how many nights I was on my hands and knees praying to anybody who would listen, because, I pretty much put everything on the line. And I had 3 little kids, and we didn't know if we were going to make it or not. And that's a different sensibility, right? That's not for everybody. So you got to recognize what your tolerance level is, and especially if you happen to be in a partnership, you got to realize what the partnership is able to sustain. Because I was fortunate enough to have a wife that was able to tolerate it. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't easy, but she was able to kind of ride it out with me. And then even once we got going, there's a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. So that's the piece that I think is something a lot of folks are not ready for.
Yeah.
And you got to realize, and it's like, it is contact sport. You're going to get bashed, and you got to be ready to get back. But if you have that mentality, you have a vision, and to your point, what you made earlier is that you see the opening in whatever industry it is, and you see it, you've done your homework, it's there, then you got to just put your back behind it and go all in.
Man, I love that. That's a great piece of advice. And just to kind of close up from our end, I want to give you the floor. Are there any particular initiatives or upcoming projects at Rabbit Hole that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, actually, there's two projects that are happening. One of the things it's I don't know how many people know about this, but about 4 years ago, we partnered up with Pernod Ricard. Pernod Ricard is the second largest spirit company in the world. At the time, once we got the distillery going, and because it was such a unique brand and this unique distillery, we had a lot of big companies knock on our door. And I pretty much said no to all of them, with the exception of Pernod Ricard. And the reason is that I felt that there was a cultural fit. And that cultural fit was in part related to that entrepreneurship, because the CEO of Pernod Ricard is a gentleman named Alex Ricard. His grandfather started the company. His grandfather, very much like me, started from scratch. And what I felt was that DNA is still deeply rooted in the company. And one of the things that Alex said to me very early on, which I really appreciated, he's like, listen, Kaveh, we know how to do Absolute Watermelon, Jameson Orange. We don't know how to do Rabbit Hole. And believe it or not, I talked to probably half a dozen large companies. None of them got that. None of them got it because they wanted to come in. You've got an idea, you got a company that's like at a certain point, they want to just pluck it and get you out of here, or get you to be like a guy who just walks around, shakes hands, and kisses babies. And I didn't want that. So basically the conversation led to the point that I said, listen, I want two things. He said, okay. I said, one, I want to make sure with your help that Rabbit Hole becomes one of the next big, great American whiskey brands. So we need that distribution, we need the sales, we need that part of it. The second piece, don't put any handcuffs on me. And he said, what do you mean? I said, listen, I have this mantra that says, just shoot me if I only have one idea. I've got a bunch of other ideas, and I don't want to, I don't want to just languish because I'm gonna wither away. I'm a restless soul, and I like to create different things. Long and short of it, I said, listen, when the time comes, I got a few other ideas. I'd love to be able to kind of see what we can do with it. And sure enough, last year I was in Paris and I pitched to him 4 different new brands, completely new brands.
Really?
And he wanted to do all of them. So we decided to do 2 out of the 4 just to get going. There's another bourbon brand that's getting launched next month. And there's a flavored whiskey that's getting launched this summer. It's a testament to the relationship. It's that faith and building that relationship because, 3 years, 4 years later, he knows that what kind of person I am. I know what kind of person he is. And the beauty of it is that I do the work. They've got deep pockets, so I don't have to go hit the road and collect cash. And we're able to do some cool things.
That's exciting. Really good to hear that. I'm really excited to hear that. All right, any questions? Do we have any questions in the room?
Thank you for your story. My name is Vanessa Williams Harvey. I'm the founder and CEO of Boost 24. As a new entrepreneur who is beginning to venture out into the funding arena, and I'm a registered nurse by profession, so I get your clinical background. And business is something very new to me, so it's a new language. How did you capture your first investors? I believe I heard you say you had over 100 investors, which I find phenomenal and overwhelming. But how did you capture your first initial investors, if you can give some advice to someone?
Yeah, I had about 110 investors, and collectively raised $18 million from 110 investors. It was really hard, and the first round and the earliest rounds were the hardest. I think the biggest thing that I had to do is to show basically not only the idea has traction, but also we have in our case I had to show that there's assets in place. So the contract that I mentioned earlier was probably at the time one of the most valuable things that I created, which was going out there showing the investors that I actually have a long-term contract to produce bourbon at a certain cost, which was really important. I also had to make the investment and purchase the property. The distillery ended up coming in. So there was that initial investment that was all basically out of pocket that kind of gave comfort to those guys that I've got skin in the game. You know, the main thing that investors want to know, particularly of people that don't have any experience and have never been, you know, through something like, in this case, creating a brand, they want to know if you have skin in the game. So that skin in the game was really a big selling point. And it just kind of, I built it from there. I also had to put a team together because, you know, not a whole lot of people will say, all right, I'm going to write you a check. I'm going to write a check to a guy named Kaveh, who's a psychologist who doesn't know, has never made a drop of whiskey and never started a brand. So I had to put a team together. And that was an interesting process too, because, you know, it's, there was a lot of mistakes that were made there. I think if I can give some advice is to be really thoughtful about that part of it, because what I had to do was also to give up part of the company at points and shares here under some of those folks. And some of those folks were really helpful, and some of them were scoundrels. I mean, there was just no way to put it, just absolute scoundrels. And it's one of those things where you kind of live and learn. Going back, I can say that, you know, it was a necessary part of the process. But at the same time, if I knew what I know now, I probably would have managed it a little bit differently. But it's hard. You know, those early investors are really hard. Probably I would say the most important thing is to make sure that you have skin in the game and they know that you got skin in the game, because they're banking on you more than anything else. And that's the thing. You and the fact that you're in it.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. I myself have a similar background. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm an immigrant myself from the country, Ghana. And I'm a financial analyst at profession. But today I own a skincare line. So I'm amazed that I made a good transition just like you have done. My company is about 1,200 for gas stores, Walmart, Target, etc. And you said one thing that I'm just reinforcing what you said that really connected with me, is that because of my semi-success, I speak around the country a lot. And sometimes the conversation comes to me that it's a difficult process, like you said in the very beginning. It's not for everybody. But sometimes, because I don't want to discourage people from coming into entrepreneurship, sometimes it's difficult to say how difficult it is in the beginning. But for you to be brave and to let us all know that how difficult it is, I think I'm taking a lot of cue from you. And going forward, I'm able to share that difference. It's possible, but it's probably not going to be that easy. So I just want to, comment on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, it reminds me of, there's a lot of talk about entrepreneurship these days. And, I've talked to a lot of folks that even introduce themselves as entrepreneurs. And when I get to know them, some genuinely are, and some kind of are on the fence at best. It's a tough thing. You're absolutely right. It's not, and I genuinely believe, I don't think it's for everybody. You really need to know what your tolerance level is. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think, I do think that entrepreneurs are fucking crazy. I think we're crazy. I think you have to be somewhat crazy to just roll the dice. It's like, it reminds me of the thing back in the day when I was a psychologist. All psychologists are fucking crazy too. I tell you that. I mean, if they tell you that they're not crazy and they don't have issues, they're lying to you. They either are lying to you or you just need to go to somebody else. They're naive. It's either a combination of naiveness or just not being, truthful. And I think the same thing goes with entrepreneurs. I mean, we don't have our screws intact. And there's a certain element of, it's it's not the nicest thing to kind of think about, but we're angry people. We're competitive people. You know, if you're competitive, you want to win. All right. And if you want to win, you got to be ready to take somebody out. And if you want to take somebody out, you're not exactly Dalai Lama. So, you know, those are all elements of the personality of an entrepreneur that, you know, also makes it really hard to have a partner that would put up with that.
Yes.
So these are all elements that you got to factor in because, you know, it is a tough ride.
Thank you. One more. We have time for one more. There you go.
Ernst Young here. I'm a therapist, and so you're a psychologist. So what are some of the key ways that you use psychology to enhance and maintain your company?
Yeah, you know, I think every day there's some elements of what I did in those 20 years that that are in play. Probably the most important one, though, is empathy. I think empathy to me is one of the hardest things to practice, but probably the most important lesson that you need to keep in mind, especially as things are getting tough in the company and you got challenges, and people that are working for you have challenges. So, you know, to me, empathy is probably the biggest lesson that I learned during my clinical years, and probably the most valuable one as a CEO and an entrepreneur.
Perfect. Kaveh, I just want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for your opportunity. Thank you for reinvesting back in Louisville. Wish you much success at Rabbit Hole and your personal projects as well.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Kind of more diverse, and it becoming grateful to be kind of at the cusp.
And I had like this 65-year-old son.